Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Happy New Year, everybody. I'm excited to share the 101st episode of Between the Covers, a conversation with Leni Zumas about her latest book, Red Clocks, and the first episode of the new year. But before I do, I wanted to alert you to some new things about the show. Between the Covers is still a listener-supported labor of love. You can still go to patreon.com/betweenthecovers and support the show if you find these conversations fulfilling. You will see when you go there that you can still get a copy of Jesse Ball's fantastic co-written out-of-print book, Vera and Linus, as a reward. But I'm also going to start offering bonus material from the conversations themselves. I'm open to hearing from Patreon supporters what sorts of material they would like me to solicit from guests once the main conversation is over, whether it be reading of additional poems or essays, the giving of writing and craft advice, or something I'm not yet thinking about. Today, it will be Leni Zumas reading her blistering essay, Vos Brie Fend Light. So if this piques your curiosity, check out the page, patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And if 2018 is as good as the 2018 Between the Covers roster of upcoming guests, it's going to be a great year. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer Leni Zumas. Leni Zumas is the author of the novel The Listeners from Tin House Books, which was a finalist for the 2013 Oregon Book Award and picked as one of the Atlantic's best books of 2012, as well as the much-beloved story collection Farewell Navigator from Open City, of which Miranda July says, "If darkness has ever been your friend, your story is in here." A graduate of Brown University and of Amherst's MFA program, Zumas is a professor of creative writing in Portland State University's MFA program. Leni Zumas was first on Between the Covers several years ago to talk about A Wooden Leg, her novel in 64 cards, co-created and illustrated by Luca Di Piero. And she's back today to talk about one of the most buzzed-about books of 2018, Red Clocks from Little Brown. On nearly every most anticipated books of the year list, Red Clocks has received starred reviews from Library Journal and Booklist and has been listed as one of the top 10 books of upcoming literary fiction by Publishers Weekly. Maggie Nelson says of Red Clocks, "Leni Zumas here proves she can do almost anything. Her tale feels part Melvillian, part Lydia Davis, part Octavia Butler, but really Zumas's vision is entirely her own. Red Clocks is funny, mordant, political, poetic, alarming, and inspiring, not to mention a way forward for fiction now." Lidia Yuknavitch adds, "Move over Atwood. Leni Zumas's Red Clocks is a gender-roaring tour de force. The bodies of women in Red Clocks are each the site of resistance and revolution. I screamed out loud, I pumped my fist in the air, and I remembered how hope is forged from the ground up through the bodies of women who won't be buried." Welcome back to Between the Covers, Leni Zumas.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
So, since this book takes place in a political situation that isn't quite our own, I thought maybe we could start by doing a little bit of world building. Can you orient us to the political realities of the world of Red Clocks and some of the legislation that has occurred that makes it different than today?
Sure. So in the America of Red Clocks, Congress has passed a an amendment to the Constitution that is known as the Personhood Amendment that grants rights of life, liberty, and property to a fertilized egg at the moment of conception. And so following from this, Roe v. Wade has been reversed, and abortion is banned, as is IVF, in vitro fertilization, and other auxiliary laws that are connected to this amendment legislate adoption and who is allowed to adopt children. One now has to be married to, and with a or a marriage certificate to prove it in order to adopt. So it's a world that's a little different from ours. However, when I was building this world, what I based all of these laws on were actual proposals by legislators who are currently in the Trump administration. And this was several years ago when I first started writing Red Clocks, but I had come upon a lot of Mike Pence's ideas about women being required to have a funeral or cremation service for fetal material if they miscarried or had an abortion. He and Paul Ryan were both big advocates of quote unquote sanctity of human life legislation or fetal personhood legislation. So long before Trump came to power, there were these movements, or I'll say movements rather than one movement because I don't think it's necessarily unified, but in our country today where people want to say that a single-celled zygote has certain rights that trump the rights of the woman whose body contains it. So it's not so different a world from our world.
Yeah, and another way that, even though you started writing this before Trump, another resonance with what's going on with Trump is there's a phenomenon called the pink wall. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what the pink wall is?
Sure. So in Red Clocks, there's been an agreement between the governments of Canada and the U.S. that any woman who's seeking either an abortion or advanced fertility treatment in Canada, if found out, will be arrested and sent back to the U.S. for prosecution. The wall itself is definitely wants to echo, Trump's idea about building a southern border wall, and of course the idea of appending the word "pink" to something automatically makes it sort of have this like mainstream feminized resonance that seemed really funny to me with the word "wall," like a pink wall. But I really wanted to play around with the idea of, we have a president now who wants to seal off one of our borders, but what happens when we're actually trying to get out of the country into another country, and that country wants to have a wall against us.
So in Red Clocks we follow 4 contemporary women who one way or the other are affected by these laws. And we open the book with Roe, a high school teacher who's single and 42 years old and who's trying, but so far unsuccessfully, to get pregnant using fertility treatments. And her attempts have this added urgency because of the adoption laws. So if the fertility treatments don't work, because she's single, she soon won't be allowed to adopt as a single woman.
Right.
And in preparing for the interview, I was reading some of your conversations about this book leading to its launch, and discovered that while you were writing it, you were also pursuing fertility treatments and what you called advanced reproductive technologies. And it made me imagine an origin story for this book, a personal pursuit of pregnancy using science as an assistant against the backdrop of the political climate that you described. But I realized I was sort of fantasizing this origin story. So I was curious if you could tell us what brought these elements to become a book project, and maybe the ways your own personal pursuit of fertility treatments were used to the benefit of the project.
Yeah. I think that there's a sort of doubled origin story in the sense that years before I started writing the book, I was trying to become a single mom. And that was the first time I encountered any kind of artificial insemination scenario. I mean, I had heard about it, obviously, but I was living in New York and thinking, I wasn't in a relationship and didn't particularly want to be in one necessarily, and thought, but I do want to have a kid. And So that's when I started buying donor sperm on the internet and getting inseminated at this clinic near Columbus Circle in Manhattan. And a lot of the biographer Rose experiences at her clinic, and particularly with looking at other women and imagining their lives and seeing the wedding rings on their fingers and thinking about how different their experience is from hers. That was pretty close to my experience at the clinic that I went to. And I didn't get pregnant then. And then some years later, I was in a relationship. I still am. And my partner and I were, I was experiencing infertility. And so that's when I did IVF, which is a more, quite a more involved procedure than artificial insemination. And that was around the time that I was doing some of this research and thinking, okay, so there are all these politicians saying, IVF should be banned, and not just politicians, but, people on the internet who are commenting on, newspaper articles, if you can't have a baby the natural way, you shouldn't have one at all. And so it touched me in a pretty particular way then, in a sort of raw way, and I had a lot of rage about it. So those two different strands of experience, which are linked obviously, but were different, they both contributed to some of the questions I was pursuing in this novel.
And when you talk about that comment, if you can't have a baby a natural way, you shouldn't have a baby, do you link that with sort of a more of an anti-science orientation?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it remains something I feel really bewildered by and befuddled by, because there's so many scientific advances that people use to cure problems that I hear no complaints about. Except for maybe a small subset of people say who, if you had cancer, you wouldn't do chemo because you just want to turn everything over to the will of God, right? But even among people who wouldn't choose to do chemo themselves, I've never heard someone say, I think chemotherapy should be illegal. I don't think if you have cancer, you better deal with it the natural way. Have you ever heard someone say that?
No.
Yeah. So certainly there, and we're living in a time now which, as we know, is incredibly hostile to science and the idea of any kind of scientific fact or hypothesis or exploration. And it's pretty chilling to think about. But this was, I guess, my personal experience of that.
Yeah. One of the things that sort of linked to this that I really loved about Red Clocks is the way you as an author, it feels like you're circumambulating this question of motherhood in relationship to womanhood, with Ro, who's desperately wanting to get pregnant, with the teenager Maddie, who finds herself with an unwanted pregnancy, with Susan, who is probably the most conventional character in a family scenario with a husband and two children. And as you circle this question, it feels like you're pushing back against the idea of motherhood as a completion of womanhood, or necessarily even leading to fulfillment at all in some cases, and that none of these scenarios are necessarily pathways to happiness or misery, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. I really hope that comes across in the book, because it certainly is a continuing area of curiosity and inquiry for me about, like, how do we get to this, come to a place where we and by that I mean not just sort of cis women, but anyone alive in the world gets to a place where, okay, in order to be a real woman, again, whatever that means, you need to have the experience of childbirth or adopting or sort of nurturing somehow in a very, private ownership kind of way. And because I have had to ask that question of myself so much in my life, like, why do I want to have a kid? Like, do I want to have a kid? Where is this desire coming from? And I think, since my experience with that first set of, I'm going to buy this sperm and inseminate myself and it's going to be great. And, anyone in my life who would have said, but it's going to be really hard. I mean, and a lot of people did say that to me, and I got pretty angry at that too. It's that sense of, what are you buying into? The notion that everyone has to be in a couple or, have, in order for something not to be hard, right? What I hope happens in the book is not a closing down on that question, but an opening up of it and not reaching any resolution about it. I think where I struggled the most with that non-resolving was with the character of Susan, the wife, because during the drafting process, I could see how easy it would be to make her into a caricature or this sort of very unlikable kind of character that you'd be put off by. And that was not my goal, but neither did I want to give her some kind of triumphant awareness at the end that...
As the mother in the conventional sense of,
right.
of the way we perceive of motherhood culturally.
Exactly. Because she too is saddled with the fact that she, for her whole life, had this desire. She wanted to have kids and to live with a man who was the father of those kids. And she's doing it. And she has all these suicidal ideations about like driving her and her kids off a cliff, quite literally.
That's part of what's interesting too, is you have Ro who wants kids and hasn't been able to have a child so far, and Susan who really wanted kids and has kids. And you think there could be solidarity potentially among these different women, the four contemporary women. But you could imagine, I mean, there's that moment when Ro is at a faculty meeting and she overhears someone say, you don't really become an adult until you've had a child. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's particularly shocking to hear for her. And but you could imagine Susan subscribing to that vision. So yeah. It's you don't really get the sense that there's any sort of unifying thing happening around all these struggles as we read them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thrown into the mix, of course, is the notion of competitiveness or rivalry in any kind of friendship. But I'm especially interested in watching how that manifests in a really close female friendship, which with Ro and Susan, you're seeing them kind of at the disintegrating end of their friendship. But, one of the reasons I love the Elena Ferrante quartet is because you get to watch over the course of so many pages and years this friendship and the jealousies and competitions, as well as the sort of really fierce loyalties between these two women. You get to watch those play out.
Can you talk a little bit about writing about the taboos of motherhood? It feels like you really go there in this book in a way that I appreciated. For one, describing the way the female body changes after pregnancy, things that women confront that are never spoken about in that regard. And then also thoughts that cross a mother's mind, wanting to hit their kid or wanting to drive off the edge of the highway mm-hmm. with their kids in the car, mm-hmm. which I imagine those thoughts in a fleeting sense happen for a lot of people mm-hmm. and are never spoken. So how was that process? Was that something that just came pretty easily to you as part of the creating of the characters, or?
That's a good. Did it come easily? I think so. I mean, I think that in future work, I would love to go there even more. It's certainly been interesting to see just in, my son recently turned 5, and in the sort of 6 years or so of pregnancy or parenthood, the sheer sort of gaping awareness I've gotten about what doesn't get talked about has been really interesting. And even before that, several years ago, I had a miscarriage. And after that happened, I learned that a bunch of my friends had miscarriages that I had no idea about. And we kind of talked about, why isn't this spoken about? Like, why is this a shameful thing? And there are a lot of things about parenthood, but I think particularly motherhood that get sort of romanticized and mythologized, and including modes of knowledge, right? Like, oh, you'll figure it out, that a mother knows. And I and many people I know have been at the point like, I have no frigging idea what to do here. I don't know. I don't have an instinct. For instance, I know a bunch of people I'm close to who weren't able to breastfeed and felt like failures, like their bodies had failed and that they were not doing what they were supposed to do. And what would happen if we actually looked at the sort of history of human experience and looked at how very many women across time were probably not able to breastfeed.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Leni Zumas about her latest book, Red Clocks, from Little Brown. So the scenario in Red Clocks where any gains women have made regarding control over their own bodies has been swiftly and emphatically reversed, inevitably draws comparisons to Margaret Atwood, to Handmaid's Tale, which is, I think, even referenced in the jacket copy of the book.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're going to be asked this question, not just here. It's interesting to see that book revisited now with the TV show and people reacquainting themselves and also coinciding with the Trump administration. And I read a tweet recently about the reemergence of Handmaid's Tale that went something like, in the 1980s, Handmaid's Tale seemed improbably extreme. Today, instead, it's the hats they are wearing that don't seem very realistic. Do you consider this book in conversation with that book or with Atwood in some fashion?
Sure. I do. Not so much because of what I was thinking about when I drafted it, because that's a book I haven't read since I was in high school, and I'm in my 40s now, so it's been a while. However, I think that what happens when we make fiction is we're already inheriting so many strands and motifs and questions from people who have written before us. And she's someone who has given a great deal to national conversations about women and the future and the sort of body politic. And so even if I sort of personally, my individual self wasn't consciously thinking about Margaret Atwood while I wrote Red Clocks, certainly Red Clocks inherits a lot from The Handmaid's Tale and from Atwood's work generally. I mean, she has another novel, Surfacing, that I wrote about in my undergraduate thesis about which was interested in narratives about female artists and how those narratives were often troubled by this notion that what a woman's really supposed to produce is like another human being, to sort of like replicate this, create more workers, create more consumers, right? Rather than create these individual works of art that can be themselves somehow commodified. So her novel Surfacing is about a woman who's an artist, and so I feel indebted to that book as well. Yeah.
Is that the book where is the woman living in the wild? Yeah,
she's a children's book illustrator, and she kind of goes to figure stuff out and leaves quote unquote civilization to do it. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason I ask is because I think my favorite character is Jin Percival, who, in contrast to the other three, is a forest dweller, a forest-dwelling herbalist and forager, and she lives, at least culturally, if not literally, and perhaps literally, off the grid. To me, she's this counterpoint to the lives of the other three, and to the lives most of your readers probably have, I'm guessing. For one, she's living with an entirely different set of rules and a different belief system, which is reflected in her daily tasks and the language that she uses. And in interviews, you said that you thought of her as a young crone. And I was curious if you could speak to what you mean by a young crone and why you wanted Jin to be a young crone.
So I think of the crone figure as often, I mean, as per, dictionary definition, often it's like a woman in middle age or over 40 or an elderly woman, someone whose body is kind of no longer the fresh, nubile, sexually attractive body that more traditional femininity would, ask a body to be. So Jin is 33, 32, 33. So she's kind of on the younger side of a crone spectrum, but she has really chosen to remove herself from the social order in a lot of ways, and does not wish to be, a figure of connection or attraction or really anything at all to other people, which makes her seem, I think, pretty threatening and confusing to, people who know her, and that's why she's known in the little town as a witch. It's not just because she heals people; it's because she really has said, my hair has twigs in it, and I'm going to go to the library and kind of mutter to myself and be okay with that. And so I think in this book, and just in my work in general right now, I'm really interested in notions of soloness and singleness and apartness that are not framed as a problem in need of a solution, but are really framed as like the desirable end, right? Because I think, we have certain male figures, you can think of Thoreau or other, Jack Kerouac going up onto a mountain, and, there's this kind of heroic element to leaving society and going out on your own. But I think when a woman does it, it has really different, a different valence, and is often more like, what the hell is going on? Like, why are you doing that? And you're not going to be safe, or, something's wrong with you. Like, are you mentally troubled? Those kinds of questions, which some people have about the mender.
And that's what's, I think, adds this really great tension, is because when she's very othered, she's a object of ridicule or sort of a bemused curiosity. But also when people in the town run out of medical options, they end up going into the forest and finding her for advice and treatment. Yeah. And so there's this weird tension there with she's helping some of these same people who are in a way like reinforcing that sort of stigma on her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that when I was revising the book, especially, in the sort of wake of the 2016 election, I was thinking a lot about what happens when you have suddenly a government or a healthcare system or an education system or some sort of kind of codified system that is really failing a lot of people. And where do you go? Like, whose knowledge do you draw on then? And often it's the knowledge and resources of really marginalized people. And I think, kind of unrelated to this Mender character, but we've seen that in our own politics with which activists have done the most in terms of resisting changes to Obamacare. And, there's so many disabled activists who have been at the sort of forefront of that fight, and activists of color. Like, I think it is that sense of like, when things get really bad, people who have privilege and power, or, who used to have power, become more willing to listen to people they weren't listening to before.
Can you talk a little bit about the ways you've woven the history of witches into this book? So Red Clocks takes place near Salem, Oregon, and you sort of play with this connection to Salem, Massachusetts in the book. And there's some questions about Jin's lineage, the herbalist. But could you maybe tell us what you were researching, and why you were researching it and weaving it into the story?
Yeah, the fact that the capital of Oregon is a town called Salem was a really happy and convenient accident for me, because originally the book was set in some sort of unspecified northeast Atlantic coast, like maybe the coast of Canada. And even back then I was thinking, okay, could they have a reason to go to Salem, Massachusetts? Like, can I get that word in there somehow? And then I take a job at Portland State and move to Oregon, and Salem, Oregon. So that was just a bit of luck. But I read a bunch of transcripts of the Salem witch trials, Salem, Massachusetts, and originally had some of that language in Jin Percival's courtroom trial. And it was very pleasurable for me to do that. It didn't serve the book that well, and so most of that got taken out in revision. But what I was interested to kind of notice and maybe import somehow is the sense of a theatrical kind of performance that is already like the outcome has already been decided, right? That as soon as, in the late 1600s, like someone had said, this woman has done witchery, this woman has consorted with the devil, like that made it so in the eyes of people around. So the trial itself was not an actual trial. And that's different in this book. And without, giving too much away, I think that there are ways in which I wanted to add actually kind of a more comedic element into her trial that stuff comes out basically from the mouth of a fool in this particular trial. But
Can you speak to maybe even things that aren't in the book, but things that you uncovered? Like there were some things you mentioned, like I wrote down, I don't know if you made this up or if this is something you discovered, but the witch cakes.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah. So cakes baked with rye flour and urine from girls stricken by spells.
Yes.
And you'd feed it to a dog.
And if the dog got upset or died, I can't remember.
So what I have is when the dog ate it, a witch would suffer. So if the dog ate the witch cake, then the witch who cast a spell on the girls whose urine is in the cake would groan. And so you would know that she was a witch. So she'd be nearby and she'd groan and you could catch her.
That's right. Yeah, that was a thing that
That's
somehow
amazing.
happened. Yes, the witch cake. And also just the idea of rye flour and urine and how that would taste. I can kind of imagine like a particular combo of that. And also, there's a sort of, whether it's literal or symbolic, foremother of Jane Percival is this witch from Massachusetts named Goody Hallett, who had been a 16-year-old beauty who got seduced by a pirate. And then he leaves her. And so her revenge against him is to, in various ways, she used to trick ships to come closer to shore where they would crash on the rocks by tying lights onto whales' tails. And that was the sort of story about her. And so I was uncovering all this cool stuff about this Goody Hallett figure. And I wanted Jen to be her descendant.
Did you know of Goody before the book?
No, I didn't. No. That particular one I didn't.
Yeah, there were some really just great little details like that. This one isn't really around witches, but you have this detail around Scottish virgins, and they would douse charred peat moss with cow urine and hang it in the doorway. And then whatever color the urine turned to the peat moss, that would be the color of their future husband's hair.
Yeah. There's a lot of urine.
There's a lot of urine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what that particular one, the peat moss husband hair foretelling, I mean, how many varieties of hair color can there really be? Like how would you use that information? Like, oh, he has blonde hair.
Right. Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah.
One of the things that stuck out around the witch aspect in this book, just with what's going on right now with all of the Me Too movement and sexual harassment is, I mean, obviously there was an irony, and there is an irony around these men often using the word witch hunt. We're scared there's going to be a witch hunt against us, which is really underscored by this book, how impossible it is to use that word as a man in that context.
Yeah, there was that great Lindy West piece in the New York Times, and the headline was, "Yes, there is a witch hunt. I am a witch, and I am hunting you." I mean, the word witch itself is so freighted with all kinds of cliches and stereotypes, and I think it's also sort of the figure of the witch is kind of having a little renaissance of trendiness right now, which that's cool. Like, I'd rather that be trendy than, the frat boy identity is now trending or something. But yeah, with witch hunt, it's all, also the fact that in American politics, we think back to the quote unquote witch hunt of the McCarthy era, and some of those same, tactics that Joe McCarthy was using, I really see happening in the Trump administration, like creating paranoia and pitting people against each other, and sort of changing the rules about like what's okay to do. And And so that sort of doubles or triples the irony of using witch hunt in that context.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Leni Zumas about her latest book, Red Clocks. And I think this is a good time to hear a little bit of the prose. And the reason I want to do two little excerpts, because one of the pleasures as a reader of reading this book is it feels like you have these different sets of word banks that you're juxtaposing with each other. And you go very much into the music or syntax of these different worlds. So we have the language of reproductive science, of political legislation, of polar explorations, which we'll get to talking about soon, and the language of medicinal plants, where you describe a particular herbal tea as tasting like water buried underground for months in a bowl of rotted wood, swum through by worms, spat into by a burrowing vole, which I thought was amazing. So if you don't mind reading the first paragraph on page 8 and then the first paragraph on page 182,
Sure.
and just so people can hear the differences in sound between the two.
She drives west on Highway 22 into dark hills dense with hemlock, fir, and spruce. Oregon has the best trees in America, soaring and shaggy-winged, alpine sinister. Her tree gratitude mutes her doctor resentment. 2 hours from his office, her car crests the cliff road and the church steeple juts into view. The rest of town follows, hunched in rucked hills sloping to the water. Smoke coils from the pub chimney, fishing nets pile on the shore. In Newville, you can watch the sea eat the ground over and over, unstopping. Millions of abyssal thalassic acres. The sea does not ask permission or wait for instruction. It doesn't suffer from not knowing what on earth exactly it is meant to do. Today, its walls are high, white lather torn, crashing hard at the sea stacks. Angry sea, people say, but to the biographer, the ascribing of human feeling to a body so inhumanly itself is wrong. The water heaves up for reasons they don't have names for. And so this is part of the Mender section elsewhere in the book. She is come from walking on the bottom of the sea. There the tiny eyeless and the footless walked with she. Ran with she the finned and flattened, sailed with she the lungless. Swayed with she the phantom grasses, lantern fishes, wolf eels. To the north bathed viperfish who did not even see she. To the south flew goblin sharks who did not even eat she. Toed a wolf eel, thumbed a skate, fingered the sucker of a cockeyed squid.
I know you were a student of Noy Holland, who, along with a whole bunch of other writers, Ben Marcus, Sam Lipsyte, Christine Scutt, Amy Hempel, were students of Gordon Lish. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that unites these writers, and also you among them, is that they're prose writers with us, I would call a poetics, with an attending to the music within or between sentences. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about anything that you feel like you've gleaned from her in particular that manifests itself in this book.
So much I've learned from Noy Holland, and I'm so grateful to her for. It was in her workshops in grad school that I sort of first heard someone put not necessarily a name to, but have a way of articulating something that I had been thinking about vaguely and imperfectly in my own work about acoustics and rhythm and repetition and sort of sonic affiliation, and that's something that Noy really foregrounded in her teaching as well as her work, which is incredible and sort of beautiful and almost painful ways, because there is so much attention to the kind of tactile elements of sentences, and she was also someone who really pushed me to think about syntax, and that's certainly a thing that Lish writers are great at doing, is looking at how to maybe uncouple or untether word order from the really familiar kind of received patterns that our ear is looking for. And in the passage I just read from Red Clocks, just substituting the word she with her, putting that pronoun in the wrong place, does a lot of work that and it's not an accident, obviously, that it's the female sort of subject pronoun. What happens when it is moved or it shows up in the wrong place? How does that sound? And the kind of energy that emerges from that.
When Kyle Miner came on the show, one of the things that he said was that studying poetry was the most transformative thing for his fiction. Mm-hmm. And I've had several listeners actually reach out in the years since that interview to say that was also ended up being true for, they took that to heart and that ended up being true for them as well. And do you have any thoughts to chime in on that?
Only that I agree. Yeah. Kyle's right. I mean, and again, with Noi, I think, I mean, she started out as a poet, and I think that made her such a good teacher for me because she could sort of point to non-narrative and non-sense-making language to look at. But also, I was lucky to be at UMass Amherst when Jim Tate, Dara Wire, Peter Gizzi were all teaching there, and the classes I took with them were just as important as workshops. It was in one of Jim Tate's classes that I read Anne Carson's The Glass Essay, which remains one of my favorite poems, and was important to me in helping me figure out how to write The Listeners. And also that's where I was introduced for the first time to the poet Frank Stanford, whom I love, and who is a total storyteller in his poems, but resists the kind of getting to dinner from lunch element of a lot of narrative.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about narrative now, because obviously this book shares an attentiveness to language, as people just heard, like your other books, The Listeners and Farewell Navigator. But what feels new about this book is that it also feels like it's a page turner, and that there's been attention particularly paid to plot in relationship to the building of stakes and tension. And you've talked before multiple times in interviews about your ambivalence about plot, and also your trouble grappling with it at times. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that previous ambivalence and also your current embracing of it?
Sure. I think one source of prior ambivalence and still present ambivalence is the ways in which plot sort of takes over or can take over the discovery process, both for writer and reader, and shut it down, right? So that if a writer goes into a story thinking, okay, I've got to follow Freytag's triangle here, I've got to, develop this, and then we have this one sort of crisis, and then the denouement, what isn't discovered or revealed or explored because, you're trying to be really loyal to that trajectory. And then for the reader, I think to read only for what will happen next, can steal away some of the biggest pleasures of reading, whether it's the language itself or kind of character strangeness, that doesn't have to do with plot. So when I was revising Red Clocks, I worked with a brilliant editor named Lee Boudreau, who kind of helped me to think about plot in a different way from how I'd been thinking about it, because she really put the focus not on, okay, we have to do the traditional thing of ramping up to something and then, having this big blowout resolution. But she talked about pressure and what was putting pressure on characters. And that felt sort of meaningfully different from simply, okay, what's the next plot point and how are we going to, tie up this plot? It was more what forces, whether internal, external, based on incident or based on, pain or other kind of emotional energy, what is pushing and forcing the character into a different place from where she was standing 5 minutes ago. And Lee Boudreau also talked about closing doors on characters and not leaving doors open. And if I'd heard that before, I couldn't remember hearing it. I mean, for me, that was sort of this new idea of rather than have, say, a character make a choice or go on a trip or go, say something to another person, have that be consequential and make it so that that character can then no longer go back and do a sort of easy redo, right? And it doesn't have to be in some huge dramatic way, but it could simply be, you know, once you've uttered these 3 words to another person, the air between you is never going to be the same. And so I was just, again, so lucky to have her as the editor for this book, because she could see, you know, for Ro or Maddie or Jen or Susan, like, what if you went a little more through that door and then closed it behind that woman? What would happen?
Well, I want to talk about another thing that I think is surprising and unconventional and defamiliarizing about Red Clocks is the aspect of naming. This was true in The Listeners, where no one in the family is allowed to say the name of the person who's died. But here in Red Clocks, you create a tension around naming in a really interesting formal way. Each of the characters has a name, but they also have a name that is a function. So Susan is the wife, Maddie the daughter, and Jen is the mender. But the unusual choice you make is that whenever we are in the chapter in the point of view of a given person, they're only referred to by the name that is their function, and we only discover their other name, their given name, when they're referred to in someone else's chapter. So when we're in Maddie's chapter, she's always going to be referred to as the daughter, which seems like the counterintuitive choice, because it sort of puts us farther away in one respect from her, while we're in the chapter that's purportedly closer to her. So what's going on there with those names?
I kind of did that inversion because I wanted to see what would happen when the character's sort of point of view chapter, you know, because it's all third person, but, you know, you have a close third on, so it is pretty private to their experience, is forced to contend with other people's labels for them, in the same way that, you know, any one of us can kind of go through our lives and, oh, my name is Leni and I have this individual self and I'm so special and unique. And yet in a lot of ways, to so many other people, I am just the neighbor or someone's mom or a teacher or, you know, someone standing in line in front of you. And that sort of distance from ourselves or the fact of not being able to claim a complex identity, I wanted to see what would happen at the level of the sentence when, as you say, you know, in a chapter about this daughter character, she is the daughter. And so it was kind of just a way to disturb that more predictable link between a name and an identity.
Did you go down any rabbit holes around naming in relationship to spell casting and witches at all?
In my head, I did, certainly. And because, as you say, in the listeners, there was that sense that if you said the name of this dead sister or dead daughter, like something bad would happen. And that was actually based on my own father's experience when he lost his brother. Like, no one in the family was allowed to say the brother's name, and there's a lot of superstition around what would happen if you said his name. But actually, there was a lot more play with names in the book in earlier iterations. For instance, whenever Jen Percival was thinking about a certain herb, you would get the Latin name of that herb, and then she would sort of play around with the Latin names and mix them up somehow. And I think I came to believe that was interesting more to me than it would be to anyone else. And but God, yeah, I mean, whether it's the idea of a spell or casting something or even the fact that, you know, sexual harassment wasn't a phrase in our sort of national lexicon until really recently. And so what happened before then? Like, if someone was experiencing what we know today as sexual harassment, how did they even think about that? If you can't name the thing, what do you do with it?
Yeah. When Talia Field was in town for Between the Covers, and she did her performative public reading
which was amazing,
which you were a part of, you brought a draft of Red Clocks in progress and had self-selected some portions that specifically had to do with animals. Talia Field's book links the status and treatment of animals in 19th century France with the status and treatment of women, and she links their abuse and also portrays the women at the forefront of the defense of animals and animal rights. And I was wondering what function you see animals, from Jin Percival's own animals to the beached whales on the coastline. What role are they playing in Red Clocks? Because they are, I don't know if they're foregrounded, but they're recurrent in the book, and it feels like I'm just curious what's happening there.
Yeah, with the whales, especially, I think they came into the book at the beginning just because I like whales and I like thinking about them and different sort of mythologies around them. And yet whales are kind of troublesome because they're so symbolic, and there's a pretty narrow little set of meanings that whales usually have when people talk about them. They're these, gentle giants whose murder is telling us about our own sort of rotten, like, inhumanity. And as with many things, like animals get put in the service of, human beings thinking about themselves. And that was something I was thinking about in writing the book. And I probably fall prey to doing that sometimes too. But I really wanted to know what would happen if, say, someone like the mender, her animals are her companions, and she has a connection to them that is really real and valid and ordinary and daily. Whereas the daughter has these dreams of becoming a marine biologist and saving whales and going to the Faroe Islands and saving the pilot whale dolphins who were slaughtered there. And but she still has this a pretty reductive or simple idea of what that would mean, right? So does that start to answer your question?
It does. It also just made me think of the weird fact that I learned, I think both in this book and Talia Field's book, that animals were put on trial as part of the witch trials.
Yes.
Which just seems so bizarre.
Yeah. And for centuries, in Europe, especially in France and Germany, like, this was a thing. And sometimes animals would have lawyers, and there would actually be a trial. But the idea that a mule could have as much agency as the man who is found having sex with the mule, and they both need to be hanged, is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And another example of, putting the kind of anxiety of a group of people, whether it's like the village that had a drought that year, like, where does that anxiety go? Onto the body of a woman, onto the body of an animal? Certainly not, Yeah, those are popular places to put anxiety.
Well, some of the most amazing animal scenes are with the one character we haven't yet discussed, the obscure 19th century female polar explorer, Ivor. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
You think so?
Yeah.
Before we talk about the polar explorer, I'd love for you to read a section that's animal specific on page 349.
She is menstruating when she dies. Strips of burlap wadded into her crotch unfurl in the water, making a brief red cloud. A Greenland shark smells the blood from 2 miles off, turns in a slow, silent arc, and aims his sleek bulk in the blood's direction. Crumbs of her skin drift up into the brine channels. Reindeer fur and flannel threads catch on ice dendrites reaching down from the undershelf. After the apex predators have had their fill, the smaller ones feast. Hagfish, lobsters, limpets, clams, brittle stars. Then the amphipods, the bone-eating worms, the bacteria. A narwhal hunting for air holes drags its shadow across her. Krill gnaw green blooms of algae off the ceiling of ice. The explorer comes, over time, apart. Weeks after digesting Minerva-daughter's flesh, the Greenland shark is caught near the western coast of Iceland. The fishermen lop off his head and bury his body in gravel and sand, heap it with stones that press out the shark's natural poisons, urea and trimethylene oxide. After 2 or 3 months, the fish, by now fermented, is sliced and hung in a shed to dry. The pieces grow a brown crust, a shocking smell. When citizens of Reykjavik eat the shark on December 25th, 1885, they are eating Ivar Minervadottir. She did not leave behind money or property or a book or a child, but her corpse kept alive creatures who, in turn, kept other creatures alive.
Been listening to Leni Zumas read from Red Clocks. So Ro, the woman the book opens with, the woman pursuing fertility treatment, she's writing a biography on Ivar. And periodically we get sections on Ivar presented to us in a different font, sometimes with words crossed out, and often including these really wonderfully strange recipes, or how to skin a puffin or how to cook pilot whale meat. So I would love you to introduce us to her a little bit. Tell us about the polar explorer, as she's referred to in her own chapters, and why Ro is particularly fascinated in writing a biography of her among any number of options.
Yeah, so Ivar Minervadottir is born in the Faroe Islands in the 1840s to a shepherd, and she doesn't go the sort of traditional route of becoming a wife and mother and staying on the island, and she kind of escapes and teaches herself hydrology, and she's particularly interested in polar hydrology and ice, and she comes to have a theory about why certain kinds of ice, certain shapes freeze and close together faster than others, which is potentially really useful for ships that are navigating Arctic waters. And she stows away on a couple of boats. And the biographer's interest in her, on the one hand, she's creating her. Like I want there to be a sense that half of the stuff she's writing, she's making up, even because she has these journals, but what does she really know about this woman's experience, right? But there's the notion of sort of salvaging, rescuing, revealing, and restoring that I think a lot of women want to do for other women who have come before us and whose stories have not been preserved or have been covered over or distorted or simply not told at all. And so there's a kind of rescue and recovery effort that the biographer is trying to do, and that sort of pairs with her own sense that, like, God, I've been working on this book for 10 years and I can't make much progress, and is this ever going to be published? And the sort of more maybe familiar questions that a writer might have of, why am I even doing this? Like, why am I telling this story, right? So I wanted there to be that kind of earnestness and solidity of desire paired with just self-doubt.
And to be clear, the polar explorer isn't just a forgotten, colorful historical figure who happens to be a woman and so may be forgotten because of her being a woman, but she was also a groundbreaking scientist.
Yes.
whose research gets erased.
Yes. It has to be published under a man's name.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that recovery is a reclamation of the work that she did.
That's right. The intellectual labor and the actual, the contribution that she made to science, which was, I did a little bit of, studying up on different scientific medals and honors that, the Royal Society had given. And they're, it's not surprising looking at all the causes and conditions that would prevent this from happening, but there's so few women who do get kind of acknowledged for their scientific contributions. And I think that putting that question in the space of the Arctic in particular was interesting to me, because that tends to be the space of like this very kind of masculine, like let us go into peril and have our, hard bodies be assailed by the wind and the cold and the polar bears and see if we can conquer it. It's really about conquering and colonizing a space that is scary. And what happens when you put like a female figure into that.
Yeah. And maybe the reclamation project of Ro, and I know it's reductive, but I feel like a particular connection between you and Ro. But
I do too. Yeah.
But that reclamation project reminds me of that page on your website, Gratitudes, where you have the images of all the women writers, artists, and otherwise that you have gratitude towards as for you as an artist. I encourage people to go look there. I'm curious about your particular interest in Poles, because I think of the history of Poles in literature, especially in the 19th century. So we have Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and we have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we have Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. But what's interesting about all those times is that at that time, the pole was an imaginative place. Right. We didn't know what was there. And so these authors were projecting a world onto the poles. And there's all these really fascinating 19th century mythologies that connect to it. But what is your fascination with the poles in the 21st century?
Probably part of my fascination can't really be quantified in a very articulate way, because it's simply what happens when I imagine what it would feel like to be so stranded and alone and away from comfort. That's a more sort of visceral thing. But I also think it's a lot about that's one of the spaces that is, signaling constantly danger, danger, danger. Like, look what we are doing to this planet. And the fact that in writing about this 19th century explorer who was making it easier for ships to kind of go up into the Arctic and create trade routes, like with, other parts of the world, like all of those things which were seen as such wonderful developments had serious consequences in terms of helping destroy the earth. And that's still happening. And so if we think about like oil and gas and what is still being taken from those areas, and how it's almost like there's the whole canary in the coal mine. It's like the Arctic, I think of it as like the coal mine itself, but we're looking at the coal mine and it's already telling us what's wrong.
Have you read Poe's novel?
I haven't. Because I've read about it, but I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, because it's playing with the idea that as you get closer to the poles, if you get past a certain amount of ice, it actually gets warmer, and the birds are migrating in the opposite direction. And there was a theory at the time that the Garden of Eden might be at the pole, but there was also the theory that a lot of people had that there were holes in the pole that went into the earth. But he had this really, it didn't feel really examined, just disturbing racial component to that book, where you discover this island of super black people near the pole, and then this really bizarre, supernatural, very white creature at the hole, when you get to the hole at the pole. But in contrast to Poe, I felt like Red Clocks did something with race that I thought was really interesting. And I've brought this up around my conversation with Claudia Rankine probably too many times on this show, but when she came on the show, she talked about how white writers almost never write about race while staying in their bodies, that they imagine themselves as the slave, or as an African, but they didn't move around with their body being white and confronting questions of race, or very few did. And she did name some on the show, and I didn't recognize their names. But this was the first book since that conversation where I really felt like it was doing that. And where I was aware of whiteness not as a default, universal, neutral category, but as a race with all the implications that come with this. And without that being the focus of the book, it feels like this really... It doesn't feel like it requires that much in terms of words. And I remember, again, Claudia Rankine recently had shown like a poem by a student where she said, what if you included knowledge that this was going on at the same time as this poem, and revised with incorporating, let's say there was a race riot or whatever that was going on that was excluded from the poem. You do this in the book, and I'd like you to read this one really brief paragraph on page 20 about the history of Salem and then sort of expand from here, because I feel like this one paragraph, which is not indicative of the book as a whole, does this enormous amount of work. So if you don't mind reading it, I'd like to talk about it.
Sure. The daughter grew up in a city born of the terror of the vastness of space, where the streets lie tight in a grid. The men who built Salem, Oregon, were white Methodist missionaries who followed white fur trade trappers to the Pacific Northwest, and the missionaries were less excited than the trappers by the wildness foaming in every direction. They laid their town in a valley that had been fished, harvested in winter camps for centuries by the Kalapuya people, who in the 1850s were forced onto reservations by the U.S. government. In the stolen valley, the whites huddled and crouched, made everything smaller. Downtown Salem is a box of streets Britishly named, church and cottage and market, summer and winter and east.
The way you repeat the word white rather than assuming it makes me think back to the power of naming. So when you say the word white later, when you call a character white-skinned, which you do, we think back to the origins of Oregon and the origins of Salem. And again, when we learn of the Hell's Canyon massacre, which you briefly mentioned, or about the Chinese laborers that built the railroad, it too points to the whiteness of our characters, because most of these characters in this book are white.
Yeah.
Even when 99% of the book isn't directly about this, I feel like we're placed, not just in geography, but in the history of what happened in that place, that these people are moving around in, rather than sort of moving around in sort of a dreamscape. Mm-hmm. And it also makes me think of Toni Morrison, who rejects the phrase people of color for people who aren't people of color. And she maintains that it maintains the default as white, and that white transcends other colors rather than simply being one of them. And in a way, I feel like Red Clocks makes white a color, if that makes sense. And I don't know if this is, if there was something you were doing very consciously, or if this ended up...
Absolutely, yeah. And your reading of it is, I'm happy to hear it, because I think in... especially in the parts of this book that were written after I'd moved to Oregon, which is most of, I moved here in 2011. I was thinking a lot about what it meant to live in a place that is known as, the whitest city in America, the whitest state in America, and how whiteness operates in the history of Oregon. And a lot of stuff about our history here I didn't know before moving here. Just so many race laws that were on the books for years, like until the 1920s, some of them, or the 1970s. And so in the character of the daughter in particular, I really wanted to, try and write a character who's kind of coming to be like aware of her own whiteness and what it does in the world, right? So, one of the ways that happens for her is that her best friend, who's African-American, sort of has a particular experience that is different from what she would have had if she were white, like the daughter. But it's, and again, it's tricky, because I think that, and this is something I talk about with students in class a lot, like there are certain things in writing that it would be a lot easier if you just avoid it altogether. There's a kind of messiness and doubt for me in writing about race that I think is really necessary to stay with that discomfort, rather than thinking like, oh, is it too neat and tidy that the daughter's white and her friend Yasmin is black? Like, what if, both of them were biracial and, shared, one parent's race and not another, all those questions that proliferate. But in the end, it was something that I'm trying to do throughout this book, is locate the characters in that privilege and in the discomfort of that privilege.
Yeah, I mean, even when the characters aren't necessarily aware of it, the fact that the narrative is presenting these facts, which probably in total is 1 or 2 pages of the entire book, but spread out in very brief mentions. Yeah. I was just shocked at how much of an effect it had. like an outsized effect
Yeah.
at changing the experience of reading it.
Well, that's interesting too, and in the scope of a novel. I mean, this happens obviously in a short story too, but what you can make happen with accumulation, and as you say, like if something is deployed on page 20, the ways in which that is going to shade everything that comes after it.
Well, and another note around race and gender and class, there's also a page of Rose notes from the Ivor biography where I feel like we see the limits of white feminism in the absence of a larger structural analysis, where she wonders if her hero, a woman who succeeded where no woman was allowed to succeed, was through her research enabling more accessible drilling and resource extraction, more ways of theft from the non-whites in the polar regions who aren't mentioned. And I thought that was also done. I mean, this could be done very heavy-handedly, but this is done in passing. But it was very fascinating to have that introduced, to have the hero. I mean, this is clearly a hero, in so many ways, but also with potential limitations of analysis.
Yeah, and that's another tension that I think is kind of calls back to the epigraph of this book, the Virginia Woolf quote. The other lighthouse was true too. Nothing is simply one thing. How hard and necessary it is to hold both of the, 2, 3, 10, 20 conflicting truths about someone in your head at once, and how tempting it is not to do that. Like you have this really heroic person. Let's just kind of like cover over the fact that, these other consequences were happening. And it's so messy,
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question around the epigraph of the lighthouse. So I'll just say it for posterity, but it does feel like, even though the book isn't about animals or about race or colonialism, it feels like by leaning deeply into the autonomy or lack thereof of women, that perhaps you're saying that if your eyes are open, it will lead to all these other things. That's what I wondered if the quote from the To the Lighthouse was about, in the sense that
I love that.
They're connected.
Yeah, that intersectional kind of truth, like underneath a focus on this versus a focus on that. Yeah, I love that, David. And that was not that particular way of imagining it wasn't conscious for me. I think it was more about nothing in life, like much less ourselves, being only one way and having to deal with that, rather than try to kind of reduce things to this essence that isn't actually true about them.
Yeah.
Whether they're dead whales or, a person trying to get an abortion, or a state that, in the 21st century really prizes this feeling of like progressiveness, and, we have curbside compost pickup and all these things. And yet, it has this really violent, like white supremacist history that it's built upon, right? So what do you do with that? And how do you understand it in a way that's not sort of deleting one thing in order to look at the other thing?
Well, you were asked a question in one interview, which I don't think I would normally ask, because I feel like it puts a lot of weight on someone's shoulders, but you answered it in such a great way, and I'm just curious to hear you answer it now again, even if it's differently. But you were asked what advice you have for aspiring feminist writers, and at the time you gave a really interesting answer. And does anything come to mind in particular when you hear that question again?
Well, I think about reading, like going backwards, not backwards in a regressive way, but just looking at who got us here, right? Because one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with, the Me Too hashtag and some of the rhetoric around this political moment, sometimes you hear phrases like, for the first time, women are speaking up, or for the first time, blah, blah, blah. And my reaction is always like, no, that's not, there's no first time about this. Like a lot of what we're able to accomplish now is because in the 70s and the 40s and the 1910s, like other women and non-binary folks were like doing this work, right? And so I think when I think of myself as a feminist writer, if I think of giving advice to aspiring feminist writers, it's really about connecting and being knowledgeable with our history, whether it's like reading Lord, reading Woolf, like reading Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, like people who did a shitload of, I can't say that on the radio, people who whose labor and sacrifice have everything to do with this moment.
Can you tell us what you're working on now, if you are working on something? I imagine this next year is going to be a whirlwind based on the buzz that's happening about this book, but do you have a project that you're working on?
I do. I have a new novel that I am working on that is probably consists of like a lot of the ways I work on novels. I have like word collections, just word lists and phrases and images, and I kind of think of those as if they're like individual Legos that will sort of like go together to make other things. I was trying to think of a less cliched thing than building blocks, but Legos is kind of uninteresting also. But so right now what I do when I want to work on that book is I'll, read my favorite dictionary is I have this crossword puzzle dictionary, which is have we talked about this before, David? It's the best dictionary in the world. It also it has etymologies of words, it has definitions, and kind of talks about like different languages or parts of the world, like how, breaking down, what's slang for, sex in the Faroe Islands or something. So I might just read the dictionary for a while. So that's probably like this phase of a novel is the most pleasurable and most private.
Well, it was great having you back on the show.
I'm so glad to talk to you, David. Thank you.
We're talking today to writer Leni Zumas about her latest novel, Red Clocks from Little Brown. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Leni Zumas' work can be found at lenizumas.com, lenizumas.com, including her wonderful gratitudes page that we mentioned in the conversation. And I'd like to thank and give a shout out to Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, Esa Petita Mi, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.